So you, because you got the most votes in the city council race, became president of the council. The council had a history of being at war with the mayor.
The history was that, like all good legislative bodies do, we have our differences with the executive branch, and we had our differences with Mayor Young. As a matter of fact, we had, personally, we were on fine terms. There wasn't a problem with that. But in terms of powers, he wanted more and more power for the executive branch, for the mayor. And we fought that on a totally bipartisan, integrated basis. We're legislators. And so as a matter of separation of powers, and it's a great American tradition, which is stronger than any racial or economic or political differences. It should be, because there should be tension between the executive and legislative branches. You want them to work together, obviously, but you don't want the executive branch to have too much power. And the legislative branch is really responsible for protecting the power of the legislative branch. And we did, and we had a couple of referendum or a couple of ballot issues in Detroit. And we won them, we being the city council, against the mayor in terms of powers. Where does this power lie? Where does that power lie? And we wanted those powers to stay in the legislative branch. He wanted those powers to be shifted to the executive branch. And we fought them and won. Again, that was a matter of principle.
Coleman Young was the first African American to be elected mayor. What difference did that make to the city and the way in which politics was done and carried out?
He was very, very proud to be the first African American. He was very conscious of the discrimination and segregation which had occurred in his lifetime. I'd say was a significant factor in politics in Detroit. Some of his rhetoric, I think, was not helpful in terms of keeping the city integrated. But he had very deep pride, which was understandable. He had overcome huge obstacles to get to where he was. He had fought in World War II in a segregated unit.
Part of Tuskegee Airmen.
Part of Tuskegee Airmen. So and he was smart and he was funny, but he had, I would say, a very strong view about the shift of power, how important it was, African Americans being in the majority, that there be a black mayor and black representatives. And on the other, I think it was understandable, kind of natural in terms of our history and his history, but it also, I don't think, contributed to the city remaining an integrated city.
In the early 60s, Detroit was described as a model urban center in northern United States. And how did the reality of race challenge that, or was that a major challenge to that understanding of Detroit and the way in which it functioned? Was race the primary issue then that became the debilitating issue, challenging issue?
I think white flight was a huge problem. It began long before Coleman Young became mayor, and it had whatever its causes were, and that maybe it's not for me to try to figure them out, but white flight became a huge issue and caused obviously a loss of population, mainly white population, but later on African American population. It became not just white flight, but middle income African American flight too. Years later, that wanted a place which would be safer, which would have better schools. And when Detroit's neighborhoods and our schools went down in general, and our neighborhoods became less safe, it was not just whites who left the city, but African Americans. And interesting now, as we speak, the percentage of whites in the city is now increasing.
Significantly?
It actually was. It's still a small percentage, but the increase was kind of significant, like, I don't know, 4% to 8% or something like that. I just happened to see that in the paper the other day. It's kind of an interesting thing. Now, the cause of that may be that African Americans are leaving the city faster than white, so that the percentage may be increased. But I don't think that's all it. I think there's a lot of young white people, particularly, who are moving back into the city now, or moving to the city, particularly singles, and particularly downtown. We have huge amounts of vacant land, but there are some parts of the city which are really extremely solid and attractive. I live downtown in a wonderful area called Lafayette Park.
You got into the race for city council looking at being encouraged by people who are saying we've got such conflict and such major problems of division. How do you evaluate your length of service in terms of addressing that agenda?
We spent our time trying to make the city work. We worked together, by the way. The city council really worked well together. We had some lively debates. Jack Kelly was a wonderful friend of mine, a real firebrand, lively, but we really worked together as a team and to try to make the city work. I guess that's the best way I could phrase it. And when we had differences with the mayor, they were never personal or personalized. Sometimes the media would try to create a clash where there was differences, but it was trying to keep the city, which was clearly losing population. We had huge problem with HUD, the federal agency, which owned housing, like 10,000 or 15,000 houses in Detroit. That vacant house problem began during that period, and we took on HUD. Because HUD said we could not remove those vacant houses even though they were open to trespass, and they were dangerous because they became dope dens and so forth. And we said, yes, we can remove that federal property if you don't keep them boarded up and not open to trespass. That became a major battle between us and the federal government, and as a matter of fact, one of the reasons I ran for the Senate in 1978.
Would have been 8. Was
yeah,
it was 79. You said.
Yeah, it was 78. The reason I ran, one of the reasons I ran, was to take on the federal government's programs, which were not working in my hometown. They were hurting my hometown, and I felt that those programs were supposed to be providing housing for people. Instead, they were providing some devastation in our neighborhood. So we knocked down a federal house, even though we were threatened with prosecution if we touched that house. I felt a little. Well, I was there directing a bulldozer one Saturday afternoon, pointing at that house, and I was told by the federal government that you touched our house and you touched federal property, and we're going to indict you. And I said, go ahead. I mean, the jury's going to convict you. They're not going to convict me because of what was going on in our neighborhood. So that problem with those vacant houses was a huge issue in the late 1960s.
I remember you took on, in a major way, another housing issue, and that was the problem of redlining, availability of mortgage funds and insurance for urban residents.
Yeah, that was one of the big issues.
In 1978, you then became a candidate for the United States Senate. How did you make your Detroit experience and those issues a basis for projecting yourself into a Senate leadership role?
I would say that my platform actually was bringing first of all, an experience of local government, regardless of where it is, to Washington. Number two is basically arguing that Washington had to understand that there were differences between local governments and that one size could not fit all. And so I tried to make the argument out that even though I was from a particular location, that what made sense for the city of Detroit doesn't necessarily make sense for a suburb outside of Detroit, or for a town in the middle of Michigan, or for a town in the Upper Peninsula. That the federal government was treating us as though it was one kind of common situation, where in fact there's huge different needs in different communities, and that I could bring that understanding of the differences between local communities to the federal government. Maybe the HUD program was working in some city in the middle of Michigan, maybe it was working. It sure wasn't working in Detroit.